Hello, and welcome to our workshop on the changes that have been made to both the procurement and travel and expenses policies. My name is Alexis Fowler, and I'm from Procurement Services, and with me is Aaron Robilliard from General Accounting. This presentation contains a great deal of information that you may have questions about. There's a section on our website that contains all of the questions and answers from previous sessions that we held. If you have questions, you may find what you're looking for there. At the end of the presentation, we will also provide you with a list of contacts you can follow up with should you have any further questions. I would like to mention that purchasing has recently rebranded and our new name is Procurement Services. You'll notice throughout the presentation and within all new documentation that we will be referred to as Procurement Services. We believe that this name change is a more accurate description of the services that we provide and more closely aligns us with the terminology used throughout the new directive as well as with other universities. Before I begin the presentation, I want to start off by saying that we are here to help. We understand that some of the changes that have been made are quite a bit different from our previous policy, and we're here to walk you through them. The first change that you're going to notice has nothing to do with the content of either policy, but the actual appearance of the documents. There is now a separate policy and procedure document for both the travel and expenses policy as well as the procurement policy. All university policies will be moving to this format. We are just the first group who has had the opportunity to use it. The policy is the formal guidance document, while the procedures contain the operational processes. The procedures will be where you will find the majority of the details. For example, all of the details in regards to mileage and meal reimbursement rates will be found in the procedures section of the travel and expenses policy. I'm now going to get into the specifics of the directives and how they've affected our current policies. On April 1st, 2011, two directives were introduced by the Government of Ontario, the Procurement Directive and the Expenses Directive. These directives apply to all designated Broader Public Sector, or BPS organizations defined under the Broader Public Sector Accountability Act of 2010. There are many organizations that fall under the category of BPS, including every university in Ontario, every College of Applied Arts and Technology, and post-secondary institution in Ontario. This is why these directives are affecting Western. The Government of Ontario is committed to protecting the interests of taxpayers and strengthening accountability for organizations that receive public funding. The purpose of the directives is to set out the requirements for the designated BPS organizations to establish rules where items are purchased or expenses are reimbursed from public funds. These rules apply to any individual in the organization making a purchase or submitting an expense claim, including board members and employees. These rules also apply to all entities controlled by Western, including Robarts, Research Park, and Ivy. We will be discussing both the procurement and expenses directives in further detail and the changes that have been made to the Western policies and procedures to comply with these directives. The broader public sector directives are in place to promote open, fair, and transparent financial practices at all broader public sector organizations. The principles for the procurement directive are based on transparency, accountability, value for money, quality service delivery, and process standardization. The principles for the expenses directive are based on transparency, accountability, value for money, and fairness. I'm going to move now into the procurement directive and the changes we've made to our policy based on the requirements. There were many requirements in the BPS Procurement Directive, however, Western's current policy and processes already complied with a good majority. The BPS Procurement Directive aligns itself with provincial trade agreements and the Management Board of Canada Procurement Directive. The directive requires that we have a supply chain code of ethics and that we have procurement policies and procedures in place, which we already do. There are several mandatory requirements of the directive, and we've had to adjust our policy to ensure compliance. The mandatory requirements are related to the competitive acquisition of consulting services regardless of dollar value, the approval authority framework related to consulting services, and the effective management of BPS contracts and documentation. The most significant change that you'll see to the new policy and procedures is around consultants and consulting services, which I'm going to cover in greater detail. On the screen, you'll see the competitive procurement thresholds for goods, non-consulting services, construction, and consulting services. The thresholds for goods, non-consulting services, and construction follow our current procurement policy and will still apply to the new policy. The big changes that you'll notice are around consulting services. Regardless of the dollar amount of the purchase, consulting services must be competitively bid. If the purchase is considered non-competitive or sole source, it requires an exemption under a trade agreement and approval from either the President or the Board, depending on the dollar amount. Another change that you should note is that any non-competitive procurement of goods and non-consulting services must be approved by an authority one level higher than the requirements for competitive procurement. The requirements clearly state that individuals must not reduce the overall value of the procurement, which means dividing a single purchase order into multiple purchase orders, in order to circumvent the approval requirements. Another one of the major changes from the directive that affects our policy is the actual definition of consultant. Western has many vendors in our system who call themselves consultants. However, under these new definitions, a great deal of them would fall under the definition of non-consulting service provider or contractor. A consultant is now defined as a person or entity that under an agreement, other than an employment agreement, provides expert or strategic advice and related services for consideration and decision-making. A non-consulting service provider or contractor is an individual or company who contracts to provide services other than consulting services to another individual or business. Because of the new approval authority framework for consulting services, where they all must be competitively bid and signed off by the President or the Board if sole sourced, you will definitely see procurement questioning the true nature of your purchase if you put through a purchase order for consulting services. Most often, we will request that you remove the word consultant from your purchase order and replace it with contractor or non-consulting service provider. Unless your consultant is providing expert or strategic advice that is going to be presented for consideration and decision-making, then it is not considered to be consulting services under the directives and our new policy. If you are unsure as to whether or not the individual that you're looking to hire is a consultant or a contractor, please get in touch with Procurement Services. We can provide you with guidance in this area and assist you with the necessary approvals. We have recently created some tools to assist you with the new process. These tools provide direction as to what documents need to be completed to support your decisions if you need to follow the non-competitive or sole source avenue. They are currently posted on our website. Should you have any questions at this time, you can certainly refer to the question and answers on our website or contact someone in Procurement Services. All of the contacts are at the end of this slideshow, and we can certainly answer your questions. We're now going to move on to the Expenses Directives. This directive was designed to improve accountability and transparency in the broader public sector. It requires that we establish expense rules, and they have provided requirements for what needs to be included in our new policy and procedures. The requirements in the directive contribute to greater alignment with the high standards expected in ministries and agencies of the Government of Ontario. There are 8 requirements that must be included in the expense rules for an organization. These include an accountability framework, the prohibition on reimbursement of meal and hospitality expenses for consultants and other contractors, rules specific to serving alcohol, rules for hospitality events, good record-keeping practices, rules for individuals making claims, rules for individuals approving claims, and we must post these rules on our public website. You can see here the numerous changes that we've made to our expenses policy in order to align ourselves with the requirements of the Expenses Directive. These include electronic claims and reimbursement, higher approvals are required in some instances, there are new timelines for the submission of receipts, claims, and advances, original itemized receipts are required, the prohibition on reimbursement of expenses for consultants and contractors, the elimination of per diems and updated meal reimbursement guidelines. Our alcohol policy has been updated. There have been some changes around hospitality, and there are new equipment and supplies thresholds. I'm now going to turn the presentation over to Erin, who is going to go into greater detail about the changes to the travel and expenses policy.
Thanks, Alexis. All employee claims must be approved using Western's online travel and expense system. Direct deposit will be the primary method of reimbursements for all employees, and manual claims will only be accepted for non-employees. This will provide reimbursements to employees on a more timely basis, and the direct deposit will be to the same account as the payroll account for the individual. The claimant is responsible for ensuring that claims for expenses are in accordance with university policy, including written explanations for any exemptions to the policy which are reasonable under the circumstances and reflect a value for money consideration. The individual who approves the expense report or cash advance is responsible for ensuring that the expenses are for university purposes only and are in accordance with university policy, including any exemptions to the policy which are documented by the claimant as being reasonable under the circumstances. The approver is also responsible for ensuring that any supporting documentation is forwarded to financial services within the specified time period. For 1/1 signatures, all cash advances and expense reports must be signed by the claimant and approved by either a senior person who is an organizational level above that of the claimant and will normally be the person to whom the claimant reports, or the owner of the account. People authorized to sign cash advances and expense reports within faculties and departments will normally be deans, AVPs, vice provosts, associate and assistant deans, chairs and directors, or their duly authorized delegates. Expenses for a group can only be claimed by the most senior person present. Expenses cannot be claimed by an individual that were incurred by his or her approver. So if you're out for a group dinner, the most senior person there is the one that needs to be putting through that claim, so that the approver is someone that was not present at the dinner. Some of the changes to the travel and expense procedures include the addition of pre-approvals for certain expenses. I would like to emphasize that travelers should always try to use the most economical means of transportation. Based on that, economy airfare is the standard that should be used for air travel. However, individuals traveling on long-haul flights, i.e. outside of North America, may book the lowest-priced, non-stop business class airfare, if funds are available and where allowable by the funding source. Approval must be obtained prior to travel by the traveler's dean, AVP, VP, or vice provost. Generally, no reimbursement will be made for reception and hospitality expenses related to social events involving only employees of Western or employees of Western and their personal guests. However, in particular circumstances, such expenses will be reimbursed provided the expenditure received the prior approval of the dean, AVP, vice provost, or above, and is supported by original itemized receipts and a fully documented written explanation. Note that celebratory events, such as retirement or holiday parties, are not considered hospitality and therefore are allowable. For these expenses where the pre-approval is now required, the pre-approval should be sent along with the original itemized receipts to financial services. These approval rules have been adjusted to agree with the requirements for individuals and approving claims laid out in the BPS Directive. For more timely reporting of expenses, we are implementing timelines for when the expenses should be submitted by. As you can see from the slide, expense reports must be completed and submitted no later than 60 days after the date of completion of the travel. Expense reports received after the 60-day period will be returned to the department. The report may be resubmitted to financial services only if circumstances warrant, and the report is accompanied by a valid, signed letter of exemption from the traveler's dean, AVP, vice provost, or budget unit head. All receipts should also be sent to financial services within 15 days from the approval of the claim, and all cash advances must be cleared by submitting an expense report to financial services within 60 days following the completion of the activity. Further reimbursements may be held if cash advances are not cleared or receipts are not submitted to the specified period of time. Original itemized receipts are now required for all expenses. The only exceptions are mileage, parking meters, valet parking, tolls, and reasonable gratuities paid in cash. This is not a change in procedure, but something that needs to be reiterated and closely monitored. This has always been Western's policy, but now it's also part of the BPS directive and will be strictly enforced. Where possible, original receipts, such as boarding passes, are preferred, but electronic receipts will be accepted. And as mentioned on the previous slide, future reimbursements may be withheld if the receipts are not received within the specified time period. In keeping with the new directives, Western can no longer reimburse any supplier, consultant, or contractor for any hospitality, incidental, or food expenses. In the past, suppliers could submit expenses for reimbursements including gratuities, meals, or personal phone calls. These types of expenses are no longer eligible for reimbursement by any broader public sector organization, including Western. Instead, suppliers, including consultants and contractors, should include these costs within their fees. Alternatively, accommodations or travel that are explicitly stated in the supplier's contract can be reimbursed. Any of these such allowable expenses must be specifically stated in the contract and not buried within the fees. Existing supplier contracts will allow for expense reimbursement. The new policy is for activity effective April 1, 2011, so any contracts negotiated after this time must follow these new guidelines. One of the biggest changes to our policy is the elimination of per diems. As the directive calls for original itemized receipts for travel-related expenses, we can no longer use per diems. Western has since moved to guidelines and included specific meal amounts that are tied to the Treasury Board rates. These specific meal amounts are for travel within Canada and the United States. For travel outside of North America, we continue to point to Treasury Board rates. These are all broken down by country on their website, and a link to the Treasury Board website is included in the new travel and expense procedure. And just so you know, these amounts on the screen are guidelines, and they do include the gratuities and taxes. And as a reminder, you cannot claim a meal if it's included in the price of prepaid travel or conference fees. Under the new directive, Western is required to make a statement with regards to alcohol reimbursement, and you will see the second bullet point on the slide is our statement. Alcoholic beverages are considered acceptable expenditures by faculty and staff where consumption is nominal or moderate. Moderate is defined by Webster's dictionary means avoiding extremes of behavior or expression and observing reasonable limits, i.e. a moderate drinker. Another guideline that we are looking to is that the cost of alcohol for any given meal should never exceed the cost of food. And as always, please consider that these are public funds when you are putting through your expenses. Providing coffee or other refreshments at an in-house meeting or education session is not considered hospitality and is an allowable expense. Celebratory events such as retirement gatherings and holiday parties are not considered hospitality and are also allowable expenses. As with all expenses now, original itemized receipts are required for reimbursement of hospitality expenses. And as discussed on an earlier slide, exceptions will be made only with prior approval from the Dean, AVP, Vice Provost, or above, and supported by original itemized receipts and a fully documented written explanation. Equipment and supplies purchases should be made through either a purchase order or with a purchasing card, and not by using an expense report. In extenuating circumstances, purchases of necessary equipment valued at $2,000 or less will be reimbursed using an expense report, provided an explanation is stated on the expense report. Equipment purchased through the Personal Expense Reimbursement, the PER program, should refer to the guidelines of the appropriate employee group. The preferred method for procuring supplies is through the university's electronic purchase requisition system, purchasing card, or preferred vendor agreement. Purchases of necessary supplies valued at $500 or less will be reimbursed using the expense report only in the following instances: where the claimant is away from the university on a field trip, at a conference, or other professional meeting, where it is more economical to obtain a personal subscription for a professional journal than to pay the university rate, or where it is more practical for an individual considering all costs and time constraints. Travel supported by research grants or contracts must comply with university regulations and policies unless specifically indicated otherwise by the granting agency. When contemplating travel supported by research funding, it's important to understand the guidelines that must be followed. A review of the agency policy guidebook or terms of contract will usually indicate the method. If it is unclear which travel procedure should be adhered to, please contact Research Accounting within Financial Services for further clarification. Individuals traveling under research-supported grants or contracts must maintain one claim per trip and one trip per claim. If there is a requirement for more than one claim, the subsequent claim must reference the initial. Also, you need to include a conference prospectus or itinerary for each claim if applicable, and those can normally be found on the conference website. It's also necessary for the principal investigator to approve expense reports and cash advances for items being charged to his or her research grant or contract, and to document the working relationship between the claimant and the principal investigator. If it's a student putting the claim through, they need to write on the claim that they are the student of the PI. A travel procedure supplement document specific to research has been created to help clarify the additional requirements for research-funded travel. A link to this document can be found in the new travel procedures. When claiming any expense, prudent and responsible use of taxpayer dollars must be taken into consideration. Always use funds effectively and economically, and you should always be able to demonstrate accountability and provide a sound business case for the expense if questioned. When submitting a claim for reimbursement, think about whether or not you would want your event or expenses made public. If you've hesitated, then maybe you should reconsider or take a second look at what you are claiming. The Financial Services website now has a section dedicated to the BPS directives and the new policies. Please visit it at the below link. Q&As from each of the sessions that were held in December were also posted on this site, and you can check there for any questions that you may have. We also have some contacts listed here. Lynn Logan is the Associate Vice President of Financial Services. Elizabeth Crichet is the Director of Procurement Services. Carter Scott, the Controller of Financial Services. Svetlana Burtnik, the Manager of Accounts Payable and Travel. And Melanie Noon is the Accounting Assistant within Travel. Any of these people would be happy to help you with any questions that you would have, and thank you very much for listening to the presentation.